The company we're going to be looking at here, compared to some of the others we've done, lasted a pretty short time. In fact, only about 7 years, from 1983 to around 1990. And yet this project is possibly the biggest I've ever undertaken. This is a company that became one of the biggest and most recognisable names of the 8-bit micro era, and not necessarily just because of the huge name behind them. It's a whole tangled web of interconnected labels and companies, and so many of the biggest names in the business were associated with them at one point or another. Ian Bell and David Braben, Mike Singleton, Julian Gollop, Graft Gold, Sensible Software, Peter Molyneux, Anita Sinclair, Geoff Crammond, Core Design, Jez San. There's so much here in this universe that way more than one video is going to be needed to cover all of it. I am talking about the Telecomsoft universe that, at its heart, consists of the three labels Firebird, Silverbird and Rainbird, but also incorporates a fair few other companies via big exclusive deals or even whole-scale buyouts, companies like Odin Computer Graphics, Beyond Software, Argonaut, Level 9 and Magnetic Scrolls. As a result of this, Telecomsoft have big fingers shoved into a whole load of very different pies. Obviously they're on some of the most famed and most successful titles of the era, the likes of Elite, The Sentinel and The Pawn. But generally speaking they've got so many games at the forefront of early 3D, or in the realms of adventures, in turn-based strategy, in action and, hell, in just plain weirdness some of the time. There are so many things to talk about, and a very complex history behind the big software house with an even bigger company behind them that's there to be unravelled. So, welcome to the Telecomsoft universe. In this first video, we'll be looking at the story of the main company itself and labels like Firebird, Silverbird and Rainbird, covering the likes of Elite, The Sentinel, Rebelstar and so many others in the bargain. In future videos we've got those other companies like Odin, Beyond, Argonaut and Magnetic Scrolls to dedicate entire videos to, a chance to cover the legendary likes of the Lords of Midnight, or the Middle-earth trilogy, or Nodes of Yesod. There's so much to do. But for now, our adventure starts at the mother base itself. So the whole parent company that's behind this kit and caboodle, the one at the start of it all, was called Telecomsoft. You probably know already, or have perhaps guessed, that Telecomsoft's parent company is British Telecom, a company whose history dates all the way back to 1846 and for most of that time were a nationalised one controlled by the state, and from there controlled by the post office. Being that this company already had a virtual monopoly over all telecommunications in the UK at the time, you may wonder why they would get into games at all. And the answer to that would be privatisation. In 1982, the government announced their intentions to sell their shares in BT to the public, and they'd become a PLC in 1984. Naturally, now that BT were a plain old and rather large corporation, there's the scope to diversify, and the world of microcomputers was a pretty natural step, although there is something notably interesting to peep at before we get to the process of being a games company. Initially, Dr. Edwin Williams, the general manager of BT's New Information Services division, was looking at a quite novel approach: the formation of a business called GameStar that would concentrate on the rental of games that would be downloaded via modem to specially modified ZX Spectrums. And yes, this was in 1983. How on earth could they have pulled this off? Well, it would have used a similar sort of technology to what BT already had at their disposal in the shape of Prestel, their interactive video text system that they had attempted to push intermittently through the first half of the decade without anywhere near as much success as, say, Minitel had in France. There would be a selection of games hosted on the network that would be refreshed every few months, a user would select a game, and that would then be downloaded through the phone line into the computer's memory. Now yes, this does sound rather similar to the likes of the Sega Channel or Nintendo's Satellaview that we would see years later. Now, as remarkably ahead of its time as all of this sounds, alas, in the early 1980s, the infrastructure wasn't there for GameStar's service to be feasible. A lot of research was done into it, and a fair bit of testing, but ultimately BT killed the GameStar service before it was due to launch, knowing that while it was potentially pioneering, the opportunity for people to actually take it up and make it a profitable venture would have been utterly minimal. While all of this happens, Dr. Edwin and his division create the Telecomsoft Entertainment Company. Initially they had a sister company named Telecomsoft Business, but of course the entertainment label is the one that would ultimately become Telecomsoft as a whole, with the business one only lasting a couple of years. James Levy, editor of the Post Office's in-house computer magazine Database, becomes the PR and marketing manager for the new company, and the Essex-based Tony Rainbird, owner of a small label named Micro Gold, is headhunted to be the interim head of the games label that Telecomsoft are starting up, with the proviso that someone else will eventually be chosen on a permanent basis. Initially the label is called Firefly Software, and a few adverts are taken out to that effect looking for staff. However, James Levy discovers quickly that the name Firefly Software is already taken. In a bit of a panic, the group hustles in search of another name that retains the fiery motif that everyone generally likes. Now, as it happened, earlier that day James had been listening to Igor Stravinsky's Firebird suite, and he put forward Firebird as a name. Everyone else liked it, and the name quickly stuck. Firebird Software was officially born in 1984. So, we now have Firebird. But even with the monster backing of British Telecom behind the scenes, it was going to take a bit more than wheelbarrows chock full of money to get the label noticed, especially in the heady days of 1984 when everyone and their ruddy mother was looking to get into the software business, from equally high-profile media companies like EMI to a schoolboy who's seen one of Imagine's Eugene Evans-based get-rich-quick adverts. Firebird's approach, initially, was more of a wussy-wug type affair than the more flowery likes of Ocean. They set up two different tiers for their software, Firebird Gold and Firebird Silver, with price points of $5.95 and $2.50 respectively. They also dispensed with the flowery cover art that a lot of other studios employed. Firebird instead decided to print screenshots of the game in question on the front of their inlays, promoting the approach with the tagline, "Seeing is believing." Yes, they even did this for ZX Spectrum games. And they had a whole bunch of launch games, ranging from the best of the many titles that had been sent in by budding coders, to ones that they had actively hunted down themselves. Said titles are a pretty varied bunch. You've got more conventional arcade titles like Run Baby Run, a game that Tony Rainbird already had on hand for Micro Gold, along with some stranger affairs like The Wild Bunch. Nothing to do with the movie of the same name, but you do play as a cowboy in this largely text-based but still kind of interesting Wild West adventure. You've even got the likes of Viking Raiders that could count as an early title in the world of turn-based strategy, ploughing similar ground to games such as Chaos and Stonkers. But of all the titles that launched British Telecom's attempt to crack the games industry, there's one that absolutely stands out above them all, the big hit that really helped to establish Firebird from the off. And that game would be Booty. Booty isn't necessarily a weird affair. It's a platform-type game where you have to go around a ship and collect all the treasure, somewhat similar to the likes of Manic Miner and what have you, only you can't actually jump in this one. Instead you have to move carefully, collecting keys, judging the pirates' moves, quickly reacting to the odd bomb that's hidden in plunder, and so on. The graphics certainly have all the trappings of the early Specky, with their blocky nature and their colour clash and all of that, but the game itself is very good. It's the work of a guy named John Kane, and it would have initially been released by Rabbit Software under the name of Jolly Roger. However, when Rabbit Software went under, James Levy seeked John out and persuaded him to bring the game to Firebird. And 'twas a good job that he did. Booty, released as part of the Silver budget range, went on to sell over 100,000 copies in almost no time at all, and the game's popularity was an early sign that BT's label was to be taken seriously. So what of some of the other games in Firebird's launch portfolio? Well, it's not all about the ZX Spectrum. The label released titles for various systems, from the Commodore 64 to the BBC Micro, although they would eventually largely stick with the big three of Specky, C64 and CPC for most of their lifespan. As you might expect, there's some hits and some misses, as well as a few interesting failures. You get the likes of Bite Bitten, a rather weird top-down game that also throws the player into a bunch of mini-games after they collect certain items and bring them back to the computer, or the aforementioned Wild Bunch, which is a curious title indeed, something that might pique the interest of fans of games such as the Oregon Trail. You've got games like Mr. Freeze that are somewhat similar to Booty but nowhere near as good, and the quite excellent Crazy Caverns. This game is sort of like playing Sokoban, only with a whole load of enemies flying about and a rather hungry face to shove the blocks into, and it is one of their best early titles. Naturally, some games are a little more derivative, with Mickey the Bricky being a take on the old Donkey Kong formula, and Gold Digger being a fair bit like Dig Dug, but there's not too much in the way of early arcade clones. By 1984, more would have generally been expected of a new studio, particularly one with the sort of backing that Firebird had, and by and large, well, they delivered on that. And pretty soon, well, they were going to be delivering a whole lot more. With the software company safely launched, Telecomsoft went ahead and found their permanent boss, as was their original plan, with Tony Rainbird retreating into the company's management alongside James Levy. A young and ambitious man named James Scholar was given the job, coming into Firebird from VNU Publications. Much like James Levy, he came from the magazine world, having been the publisher for personal computer games, and he would immediately start bringing his own cohorts to the company, including a man by the name of Herbert Wright. It was James Scholar who would orchestrate the purchase of the game that would really take the company into the stratosphere, outbidding everyone else for the hottest title in the industry: Elite. A further history of Elite can be found in the video that I did entirely dedicated to the game, but Ian Bell and David Braben's game of space exploration and trading had laid waste to all on the BBC Micro, and they'd enlisted the help of a literary agent named Jackie Lyons to sell the rights to port the game to the highest bidder. Ultimately, Telecomsoft won the fight, securing Elite for the cost of £100,000. Not surprising, perhaps, considering that they could call on the virtually infinite resources of British Telecom to secure the title. James Scholar was utterly passionate about the game, proclaiming that it was the title that would change the industry. I mean, he was pretty much correct, it has to be said. It may have cost a pretty penny to back this horse, but it would certainly prove to be worth it. A short while after buying up Elite, Telecomsoft were already able to demonstrate a beta Commodore 64 version of the game, one that Bell and Braben were putting together themselves at the LET show in February of 1985, although it did require the help of a BBC Micro to do it. Still, the game was there and running, and not much else was really needed to get everybody excited about it. Not too long after the LET show, however, something truly tragic would occur. James Scholar, the head of Telecomsoft, would suffer a massive heart attack. He would never come out of hospital, passing away in March of 1985 at the age of just 27 years old, an event that shocked the industry. James Scholar was a young and fit man, pretty much the last person you would expect to suffer from such a thing. The man who he had brought in, Herbert Wright, would become the acting head of Telecomsoft, while Joss Ellis, a veteran who'd just come out of EMI Thorne's short-lived flirtation with the games industry that had seen them pipped to the post for Elite, was enlisted as contract development manager and a crucial guiding hand for Wright. Elite would naturally be the big title for Firebird's aforementioned gold range. It would be pushed everywhere, and even presented an opportunity for Telecomsoft to reach over across the pond, setting up an office in the States in order to produce and market a version of Elite for the Apple II. It wasn't the only game in the range, obviously, there would be plenty of others. You have, for example, a rather neat arcadey rail shooter called Buggy Blast. The controls are a little tricky to get to grips with at first, and the aim of the game is somewhat esoteric, but the presentation is quite excellent. You'll also find more 3D action with the likes of Hive and Empire, as well as some C64 platforming goodness with the rather overlooked and expansive Demons of Topaz. But of the early Firebird Gold games, putting Elite to one side for a minute, the real standout title for various reasons is Gyron. Gyron is the sort of game that you could perhaps only really get in this era. In many ways it's the sort of thing you only find on the ZX Spectrum. It's a 3D game and, at its core, it should just be a simple game where you avoid the lasers from towers and try to not get your hedgeroid crushed by balls on your way to the centre of the Gyron's arena. It's somewhat similar to Geoff Crammond's much more famous Sentinel, which we'll be looking at later on. Nowadays, well, this game might be impenetrable. Hell, it's certainly a complex enough thing at the time, one of the rare games from this time that includes a program purely designed to be a tutorial for the game. But in 1985, there's certainly a lot about this game that was pretty bedazzling, what with the huge balls and the rather out there presentation and so on. There's very little like it. Gyron was also a source for that classic 80s microcomputer thing, a competition. Gyron consisted of two main programs, the opening Atrium level and a much harder level called Necropolis. If you were able to complete Necropolis, you sent proof into Firebird, who would then enter the fastest gamers into a playoff on a special arena level of the game. If you completed that, well, congratulations, you've won a Porsche 924, or £12,500 in cash, whichever you prefer. Gyron is, by all accounts, a monstrously hard and obtuse game, and not much detail exists about the competition, but it does appear that in the end, the competition was won by somebody in Spain, who opted for the car after defeating the arena level in a winning 18 minutes. This may be a tricky game to play today, but Gyron was notorious enough and successful enough for Firebird to award the game's developers, Taurus, with the responsibility of making versions of Elite for the ZX Spectrum and Amstrad CPC, which they ended up doing a fine job on. What of the budget range? Well, there's certainly some memorable titles here, that's for sure. A lot of people have memories of 1986's Thrust, for example. This game is essentially a microcomputer take on Atari's Gravitar, where you navigate difficult caverns using your wireframe ship with asteroids-esque controls, grab yourself an artifact from the depths, and then make your way out again with said artifact weighing you down. This is an infamously difficult game, perhaps one of the hardest of the whole micro era, although at least the level of difficulty is generally based in fairness, and screw-ups being entirely your fault. It was successful enough to get a sequel, Thrust 2, which is a bit more of an adventure type game using the same rules and, in all honesty, isn't anywhere near as good, but the original is definitely one of the best games in the Firebird Silver range. Naturally, you get a bunch of typical microcomputer arcade adventures, the sort of game that may be a bit incomprehensible nowadays, the likes of The Happiest Days of Your Life, or the rather popular Olli and Lissa series that started in 1986. These games can be difficult to grasp nowadays, but computer gamers were perhaps a more patient breed back then. That said, there are games such as Chicken Chase and the absolutely stinkingly god-awful Jerry the Germ that surely nobody was able to make head nor tail of even back then. Still, when it comes to this period of Firebird's budget releases, in the days before they switched them all over to the Silverbird brand, another big one that really stands out is a compilation, one that always seems to make people scratch their heads and has been looked at by people a fair few times. I am of course talking about 1985's Don't Buy This. Don't Buy This proudly proclaims on the game's front that it contains 5 of the worst games ever made. The inlay says that these titles possibly represent the end of games as we all know them. It also says that Firebird disowns all the copyright in this product and encourages buyers to copy and duplicate the cassette as well. The label even says that they will compile the complaints they receive regarding the low quality of games on the compilation, and that the complaints they like the most, so long as they're clean, will receive a special "I didn't buy this" badge or sticker. So, yeah, this is a thing. Naturally, being a major software house that advertises for budding coders to submit their games for review and possibly even release, it's only natural that Firebird would receive a fair amount of absolute dreck, and this is certainly a unique approach to dealing with such awfulness. So, are the games on Don't Buy This amongst the worst games ever made? Not really, to be honest. I mean, they're obviously rubbish, but I've certainly played an awful lot worse. The 2 most memorable ones are the games that feature a dog called Fido, of course. They are very amusingly crap. You've got Race Ace and Weasel Willy. These games are pretty basic and pretty awful, but they probably wouldn't even stand out too much on the infamous Cassette 50. And then you've got Fruit Machine, which is, it's a fruit machine. It's a one-armed bandit. and that's about it. Reviewers of the time were certainly a fair bit curious about this weird tape, but a lot of them said that the whole package was good for a laugh and, perversely, the whole thing actually worked. This quintet of games, sold in the shops for £2.50, did actually shift a few copies because, well, hey, people were curious about just what was inside, and the low price point for 5 games clearly made it worth the punt. It's probably become one of Firebird's most memorable tapes nowadays, just because not many other software houses have pulled such a stunt since then, and so naturally it needs a big old mention here. Perhaps though we should move on to something better. Something better like, well, there's the deals that Firebird made in this time period with other companies. Their attempts to get into America would see them make a few deals with fellow British games companies to release their games over there, particularly Ocean, meaning that a bunch of Ocean releases came out on American shores with Firebird branding. Another useful deal was the one they made with Ultimate Play the Game to bring some of their almighty Spectrum classics to the C64. Now sure, it may not necessarily be optimal to play the likes of Underworld or Saberwolf on the Commodore, but at least they're there. They were also probably one of the first studios to grab a bunch of classics other people had made from the earlier Micro years and re-release them on budget. Simon Brattel's mazy, adventure-y, roguelikey and really quite special early specky game, 1983's Halls of the Finns, would get a deserved re-release and higher profile through Firebird in 1986. On the whole, they're clearly doing a lot of stuff, so much so that it's hard to know where to turn to next. Perhaps though, we should look at the games that Firebird released from two of the best coders of the era, a pair of geniuses that, it can absolutely be said, managed to change gaming as a whole in their time, and they started on the microcomputers. As the title of this chapter might suggest, we're going to talk a bit about Geoff Crammond and Julian Gollop. Both of them have a couple of games apiece released through Firebird, and these games are era-defining titles, highly successful and in most cases, utterly groundbreaking. We'll start with Julian first, and his first big game, Chaos: The Battle of Wizards, a multiplayer turn-based strategy title that was based off a board game he'd created in the early 80s when he was still in school, that was also in turn based off a Games Workshop game called Warlocks. Firebird are perhaps only tangentially related to this game, re-releasing the title in 1988 after they'd already had success with Gollop's other titles, but if you're covering Julian Gollop, well, you've got to mention this one. It's one of his most important games, and it's even been cited as a personal favourite game of his. No mean feat, seeing as this is the guy who would go on to produce XCOM. The original Chaos was published, as it goes, by the aforementioned Games Workshop, who had a fairly short-lived flirtation with publishing computer games in the middle of the decade, and they worked with a rather tiny label that Gollop was a part of called Red Shift. The game itself sees a maximum of 8 players, either human or computer, take control of a wizard on the board, with the aim to be the last one standing. The main brunt of the game is going to be spent creating an army of monsters to do battle with, everything from regular grunts such as a giant rat, to the almighty golden dragon that can ride wizards around the map and destroy all in its path. The more powerful the monster, the less base chance that a spell has of succeeding. There are various other offensive and defensive spells, magic swords and knives that can increase a wizard's combat power, trees that act as barriers, blobs that can engulf and paralyse enemies, as well as the chance to raise your troops from the dead, if need be. There is plenty of depth to the game as is, even with all these mechanics, but Chaos has one mechanic that is, quite simply, absolute genius. As mentioned, all creatures have a base chance to be spawned when you cast those spells. However, you can choose whether the creature is real or if it's an illusion. If it's an illusion, then the chance of a successful cast goes up to 100%, and that monster is as powerful as it would be if it were real. However, all wizards have a disbelieve spell at their disposal. If they use this on a creature they suspect to be a fake, then it's automatically stricken from the board in a flash of light. The real or fake mechanic is an absolute core part of this game. You may be pressured by a monster chasing your wizard down, but what if that monster isn't real? Do you take that chance to test its veracity? Doing so can absolutely change the game, change the whole balance of the board. This is the sort of gameplay that has given Chaos a reputation as one of the Spectrum's greatest multiplayer games, enough of a reputation for the game itself to have a sequel, Lords of Chaos, in 1990, as well as a successful Kickstarter revival, Chaos Reborn, in 2014. The speedy pace of the gameplay and the pressured hot seat multiplayer has made this game an all-time system classic for many, and it's rather easy to see why. It's still most certainly got that spark if you can get people together to play it. The other two Gollop games here are ones that he produced with Firebird itself. After the Redshift and Games Workshop thing ebbed away, he opted to go and work with Telecomsoft, seeing as they were fairly close by to where he lived in London. It's here where he would produce the game that really set the scene for the squad-based tactics titles that he would be a master of, 1986's Rebelstar, a stunning work that was yours for £1.99 from the Firebird Silver range. This game was based on an earlier Gollop title from 1984 called Rebelstar Raiders that was done entirely in BASIC. The game's very similar in many ways, but the new Rebelstar is obviously given a much glossier coat of paint, and it also features single player modes as well as multiplayer. Initially the game was multiplayer only, but Telecomsoft insisted on single player being added to the game when Gollop took it to them. The game has you play as a group of raiders on a desperate mission to infiltrate the base of the operatives and destroy their main computer, Isaac, with little but a bunch of combat droids offering support against masses of androids and drones. One look at this game and, well, it's easy to draw a line between this and XCOM, because so much of what makes that game great is already here. The turn-based element is already tight and fast-paced, there's already different modes of fire from a direct shot that's got more chance of hitting, to a snapshot, and even setting up Overwatch. The units have action points that can be affected by things such as being wounded or encumbered, and so on. But beyond the mechanics, Julian's also set up the narrative drive and the chance to tell a story of this daring adventure. All of the raiders are named, for example. There's always the tension when an enemy droid fires a crack shot across the floor that's followed from screen to screen. Hopefully it harmlessly hits a wall, but sometimes it'll hit its mark and knock a raider stone dead. It encourages you to be so careful with movement, often using your droids to tank shots from the enemy while your raiders find their positions, creating diversions and leading the drones on a wild goose chase and finding resources wherever you can. It's superb, and one look at this shows how Julian Gollop had his winning formula down pretty early on. It may have only been a budget game, but it certainly got some rave reviews, and his titles would only get better from here. This game was naturally followed by Rebelstar 2 in 1988, once again published by Telecomsoft on the Silverbird label that we'll be hearing more about soon, and by this stage Julian Gollop had his own little studio called Target Games, later known as Mythos Games. Rebelstar 2 is certainly more of the same. The winning formula is already there, and there's not much reason to screw with it, but we now have a new mission set on a planet that's chock full of aliens, and our hero has to kill them, destroy the eggs, and ultimately kill the alien queen. Now I think it's easy to see where the inspiration for this one came from, isn't it? Rebelstar 2 functions pretty damn well as an unofficial aliens turn-based strategy game, it has to be said, and it got another lot of fantastic reviews. Rebelstar 2 marked the end of Gollop's association with Telecomsoft, but the ideas for this game would be expanded even further in his utterly classic Laser Squad, also from 1988, a game that came out on both 8 and 16-bit platforms, featuring multiple missions and maps, and the introduction of morale with units panicking and getting out of control. Of course, it's not too much of a leap from there to XCOM, a game that was originally conceived as a sequel to Laser Squad. But not all that much of it was possible without the ground being set by Rebelstar. That game's already a classic, and if you like the XCOM games, well, not only are they worth playing, but they will feel immediately familiar. Telecomsoft certainly had their part to play in the career of this UK games industry all-time great, that's for sure. Speaking of all-time industry greats, it makes sense to move from Julian Gollop to Geoff Crammond. Again, we only really have a couple of games here, but they're all very important indeed. Now of course, Geoff Crammond would change the face of motor racing games completely, particularly on the simulation side of things. But when it comes to Crammond and Telecomsoft, his biggest game didn't feature any cars at all. Instead, it featured an utterly foreboding and oppressive atmosphere, a world that's all skewered and terraformed to hell, and an indiscriminate, unfeeling monolith that only needs to set its gaze on you to destroy you. There's not a whole lot of games quite like 1986's The Sentinel, is there? Another one of the really quite famed British games of the period, not just over here but pretty much everywhere, and obviously a title that requires close attention. One of the most important games to originally appear on the BBC Micro after Elite, Geoff Crammond's inspiration for The Sentinel was mostly a technical exercise, pushing the system to produce something in real-time 3D or as close to it as possible, meaning that when moved, the computer would only need to render a new part that came from the edge of the screen, as opposed to re-rendering the entirety of the visible terrain. Crammond came from a background of using Fortran and high-level mathematics to optimise models for Marconi, and this would prove pretty important to the games that he created. The game itself took over Geoff Crammond's life for a year, 6 months to create the BBC Micro original, and then another 6 months to port the game to various platforms. At first, the game's minimal HUD and checkered landscapes can appear quite intimidating, but the Sentinel isn't actually too hard to grasp. You play as a Synthoid, and you start from the lowest point of a map with a goal to move yourself above the Sentinel's platform and absorb it. In essence, you become the Sentinel itself. Now you can't actually move, but you can look around in all directions from your viewpoint, obtain energy by absorbing it from objects, create and stack boulders, and then generate Synthoid clones that you can transfer your consciousness to. Doing so, ideally, moves you higher up the level. All the while doing this, you have to avoid the direct gaze of the Sentinel as it rotates around from its sentry position. If you do, it'll sap your energy very quickly until you die. The game will certainly take a fair bit of time. There's 10,000 levels in it, although you don't actually have to play them all, and later levels introduce other enemies such as sentries that will make progression even tougher. Once you grasp how to play the thing, it's not long before the style of play and the general mood and atmosphere of the game really grips you. It's something that's perhaps more of a circumstantial thing. As mentioned, Geoff Crammond created this game as a technical exercise more than anything else, and it certainly shines in that department, still moving quickly enough to be highly playable today. But there's just something about the game's early 3D modelling and the act of avoiding the monolithic gaze of the Sentinel that gives the game a feeling unlike very few of its contemporaries. It's a feeling that transferred pretty well through time even. You'll find a similar atmosphere from the game's PlayStation era update, Sentinel Returns. Crammond himself didn't have a huge hand in this PS1 remake, but he did support it and give it its full blessing. In the end, it's quite a remarkable game, and one that tends to work very well no matter what platform you play it on. It's not for nothing that it sticks out in the era almost as much as that Impassive Tower, and it proved to be another critical and commercial hit for Telecomsoft. The next game here takes us to the sort of thing that Crammond's much more associated with, the fine art of motor racing. But before Formula 1 Grand Prix, and before Stunt Car Racer, which we'll be looking at in a little bit, there was Revs, another original BBC Micro game initially released through Acornsoft, and one that has a Firebird association due to the Revs Plus version of the game that they published on the Commodore 64. Now it's quite funny. You might expect, due to the association that Crammond has with motor racing games and his importance to the genre, that the man himself was a lifelong racing fan. But actually, that wasn't really the case. Crammond didn't get into racing at all until he was at Acornsoft, and they asked him to do a game based on Formula 3 racing because they were, at the time, sponsoring a driver named David Hunt, the younger brother of James Hunt. It was the research he did while creating the game that would become Revs that would utterly change the trajectory of his career and the games that he would create. In a rare interview for Retro Gamer, he recollected the feeling of incredible G-force and being on what felt like a perpetual slide as David Hunt drove him around the Thruxton race circuit in a new BMW, and it seemed to become apparent that this was the sort of game that he wanted to devote himself to. It was also around this time that Crammond gave up his job at Marconi to work in computer games full-time, something we're generally a whole lot better off for. Revs is, of course, something a lot more serious and in-depth than the arcade racers that you would mostly see around that time, and it's important enough to be considered, as a documentary about the game by GP Labs here on YouTube calls it, the birth of sim racing. Certainly there's not an awful lot around like it in 1985. Geoff Crammond wanted to create something entirely different to the likes of Pole Position. Going back to his interview with Damien McFerrin in Retro Gamer, he said that his biggest challenge was accurately recreating the feeling of going into a corner, and that being something you had to turn and take a proper line into, as opposed to how it was in something like Pole Position, where it was more akin to a distorted straight line. The original BBC Micro release of the game only gives you one track to go around, that being Silverstone, but you do have multiple opponents that you can race against, from the speedy likes of Johnny Turbo to the rather easy to beat Miles Behind. You can even tinker a fair bit with a car before a race, and when you're on the track you could kind of go anywhere if you wished. It may seem silly to point out that a racing game lets you go the completely one way around a track, but I'm not sure that ever happened before Revs, and Crammond certainly did stunning work when it came to pushing this fully 3D environment out of the humble BBC Micro. Later editions of the game would add more tracks too. You would be able to race around the likes of Brands Hatch or Alton Park. The release for the game that Telecomsoft handled for the C64, Revs Plus, would also add the Nürburgring along with other expansion tracks. Being that this game is the beginning of Crammond's exploits in the sim racing genre, it kind of goes without saying that it's a very important title indeed. Finally, we have a game that, for most of its time, was earmarked for publishing through Telecomsoft, at least until the very end. It's one of Crammond's most famous classics, the brilliant Stunt Car Racer from 1989. Stunt Car Racer was a pretty big expansion on what he'd started with Revs, and he said that all in, the game took him 3 years to create. Now, rather than flat F1 tracks, you have these rocking and rolling circuits. They're off the ground, filled with ramps, jumps, crests and banks. You're going to be flying around everywhere at quite a high speed, even faster when you engage the turbo, and you're going to be racing against opponents in a bid to get to the top of the various leagues. There's damage mechanisms too. You've got to push your vehicle hard, but not too hard that you either fall off the track completely or screw up its frame by landing too forcefully on the jumps. Now, as far as the micros go, this game is quintessential, either on 8 bits or 16 bits, with the original C64 version being a total revelation and almost as stunning as the Amiga and ST ones. Perhaps the one irritation, for Geoff Crammond at least, is that the arrival of Atari's hard driving in 1989 made some people present the game as an attempt to unofficially port that arcade game to computers when, as he recalls in Retro Gamer, he didn't become aware of hard driving until the final few months of Stunt Car Racer's development. As previously mentioned, he'd been working on the game for nearly 3 years by this point. Stunt Car Racer was, by far, Geoff Crammond's most successful title to date. It was considered one of the most staggering games to come out in the history of the micros at that point, with a playability to match the technical achievement. It was good enough for some magazines to call it the best game of 1989, it's known as one of the best racing games ever made, and it's even made it onto the odd list of greatest games of all time, full stop. And of course, technically, it doesn't belong here. It didn't come out through Firebird. But that was always the plan through most of the game's development until Telecomsoft were bought by Microprose in 1989. Obviously we'll be going into the details of that at the end, but the company's new bosses decided to release Stunt Car Racer through their fairly short-lived Micro-style label instead of Firebird. In any case, when you talk about Geoff Crammond, you can't not talk about Stunt Car Racer. Over 30 years later, it's still one of the best virtual four-wheelers you will find absolutely anywhere. It's more than held up over time, it's a game you should play right frickin' now if you haven't, and as with the great man himself, it's more than earned its status as a gaming legend. As we go further into the middle of the 80s, it's fair to say that one of the issues that the whole Firebird brand had perhaps was a few too many labels. Things started out simply enough with the Firebird Silver and Firebird Gold ranges, for titles retailing at $1.99 and $5.95 respectively, but then the company wanted to add a couple more price points, and so the Gold range went up to a tenner, and a new middle label was created called Super Silver, essentially a premium budget range for games sold at £4. Then to top that off, Firebird Gold was largely replaced by another new label called Firebird Hot, again for full price games. It all gets a bit messy, especially when you consider the other labels that were in the Telecomsoft universe by this point. We'll get to them later. Eventually, by 1988, things did get a little more consolidated, with three much more separate and identifiable labels kicking about. You've got the original Firebird label, of course, but there was now the Silverbird label exclusively for budget games, with that sort of fairly identikit and distinguishable packaging that you might expect from a budget label. Now by this stage, Telecomsoft had long abandoned their early practice of selling their games with screenshots on the front in order to use cover art like everybody else, so it makes sense that they'd be in step with the general practices of the time. The third label, and one that's also quite important, is Rainbird. Another full price label, but with a marked difference to Firebird in that while Firebird focused primarily on titles of an arcadey nature, Rainbird was geared towards more sophisticated games, adventures, RPGs, war games and that sort of thing. The label actually started out life in 1986. It was originally called Bluebird before taking Tony Rainbird's surname, and the games were distinguished from the rest of Firebird's output thanks to the new logo and the predominantly blue packaging they employed. Rainbird would become the home for a fair deal of the games that Telecomsoft released in conjunction with studios they had big deals with, like Magnetic Scrolls, Level 9 and Argonaut. We're going to be hearing a great deal more about the label as this saga goes on, and we look at those companies in more detail, and they would also come to much more prominence on the 16-bit micro platforms. In fact, one of the rather unique aspects to Rainbird is that, for most of their existence, they didn't think of the Amiga as their main 16-bit platform. A lot of their games were actually designed with the Atari ST in mind, first and foremost, even if the process of time has led to the Amiga versions of Rainbird's games taking precedence, seeing as most of them came out on both platforms. In the meantime, there's still a great deal of games to look at in this period, both when it comes to budget and full price titles. We might not necessarily be able to look at every Telecomsoft game because there's so bloody many of them, but there are certainly some strong highlights. So let's chill out a bit and examine a bunch of games in depth. Now this crop of games here were all released on the various Firebird labels, and they range from budget affairs to full price ones. Hopefully it gives you a nice feel for some of the games created by the studio. Before we begin this roundup though, it should be clarified that there are a lot of games that we're going to be waiting a little bit longer to cover. The likes of Jez Sand's Starglider, Mike Singleton's Dark Scepter, the various Odin games like Heartland and what have you and so on, we'll be waiting until we get to the videos that centre on those respective companies. Don't worry though, because there's plenty enough to look at even without getting into all of these titles. So how does one describe the general output of Firebird? Interesting is perhaps one word. For a studio that's got the backing of a freaking huge conglomerate behind them, they don't half go for some quite experimental games. Perhaps the sort of stuff that might be a bit hard to understand at all now. Have a look at the Comet game here, for example. The presentation is very snazzy indeed, even if it kind of dresses up a bunch of simple minigames that play out randomly on this intergalactic journey. It's not all that good, really, but I suppose it is a better take on the sort of thing you would have seen previously in The Great Space Race. Vectron is another quite wild game. It's a very fast maze game that takes place in 3D where you have to rush around and blast alien ships, all the while avoiding crashing into the wall. It's a cool concept, but the controls kind of let it down. And then you've got a really sleek package like Cholo. This game, originally for the BBC Micro, is a 3D wireframe adventure from 1986, one that comes packed in with a whole novella a la Elite's The Dark Wheel. Again, a game like this might be quite tricky to pick up nowadays, but there was certainly a lot of effort and ambition behind it. When it comes to Firebird's games that flirt with 3D-esque trappings though, I'm really quite fond of 1988's Earthlight, a game by Pete Cook, who also happened to be responsible for some other strange and head-scratching releases like Brainstorm and the Kix-esque Zolix. This is definitely simpler action stuff, but I think the sense of depth in the levels is very nice indeed, particularly for this platform. And it's pretty quick to pick up, especially if you're playing with the keys. A very nice little game, this one. The budget range certainly takes in a few curious titles indeed. Some games are a bit more derivative, like Megabucks, a side-scrolling adventure kind of in the whole Everyone's a Wally vein, and others like Harvey Headbanner are completely freaking off the wall. There is at least a curious concept with a game like this one, even if playing it to me is, well, it's a bit like banging my head against a wall. Intriguing from a historical perspective is Galaxy Birds, primarily because it has the almighty name of Sensible Software on it. It's a very simple shoot 'em up in the Galaxian style, only with weird bird creatures that they knocked up using their own shoot 'em up construction kit, but it is fun for a little bit. One of Firebird's best budget games though absolutely has to be Mad Nurse. It's rather kooky, but also a lot of fun. In this title that most certainly got a few points for bad taste back in the day, our nurse hero has to continually pick up babies and put them in their cots before they cause themselves some, well, quite fatal damage. Don't let them go near plugs or drink up medicine that happens to be on the floor. You can temporarily stop the babies with sleeping gas, and the whole thing kind of plays out a bit like a strange old take on Tapper. Honestly, I quite like it. Also generally in the good pile are the various original Atari games that Telecomsoft released on micros in the UK thanks to Activision. There's all sorts of really excellent stuff here, from the likes of Pitfall 2 and River Raid to the absolute wonder that is Hero, probably the best pick of the whole lot. Now, how about Druid? That's another quite popular series of games by Firebird, it has to be said, and it's one that's still held up quite nicely. The original 1986 game by Dean Carter features you playing as a magician named Hazrinax, travelling through several levels and going further and further down on your quest to defeat a Dark Lord. Now you can probably tell that Gauntlet's a heavy inspiration on this one, but there's enough differences to make it stand out. One of the biggest is that you don't actually have unlimited magic and unlimited shots at your disposal, meaning you need to pick out your shots carefully and replenish your elemental supplies at the various chests as needed, and you can also summon a golem to help you out with enough energy. It's a pretty cool game, definitely one of the better Gauntlet-inspired games out there on the micros, and it proved quite popular. Popular enough even to get a port to the Famicom in Japan, handled by Jaleco. The sequel, Druid 2 Enlightenment, followed in 1988. It doesn't change an awful amount from the original, although your ammo isn't limited in this one. Not bad, but I don't think it shines particularly compared to the first game. Although its 8-bit theme song is a bit of a C64 classic. Certainly familiar to anyone who's played enough Fairlight scene releases, that's for sure. This sequel did also come out on the 16-bit platforms, and the Amiga version is somewhat interesting, as it's the first proper game programmed by a certain man named Peter Molyneux. Now, just for completion, the third game, Warlock the Avenger, came out in 1991, therefore Telecomsoft weren't involved here, and instead it's released by Millennium. It's still fine enough. This game follows the first game's formula a lot more, and even includes a 16-bit conversion of the original Druid. Graft Gold, a pretty well proven microcomputer name, also had a few releases under the Firebird banner. Their ports of Bubble Bobble and Flying Shark are the most famous ones, of course, but there are also some curious originals. How about Magnetron, for example? This game, by Steve Turner, is the not quite as well known sequel to 1986's Quasitron, and it follows a similar formula. You play as the robot Klypto, and you have to destroy all the enemy bots, either through simply shooting or ramming them, or, more ideally, grappling them and winning a contest that will see you take their equipment and become better equipped. It's a tricky game indeed, and it can be a bit difficult to get your head around its unique foibles, but a lot of things about it make it worth the effort. Also in the head-spinny department, we have Andrew Braybrook's Intensity. This is a bit odd, seeing as it uses very similar graphics to the studio's all-time classic Uridium, which makes me wonder if people picked this up expecting a sequel. But it's not, and instead it's something a great deal more slower and strategic, with resources to play with and what have you. A quirky game that reviewed well, but didn't sell well, and worth looking at so long as you don't think it's going to be anything like Uridium. Much more straightforward and also decent, we've got Soldier of Fortune, a simpler fantasy type adventure where our hero must take courage, vanquish foes, and obtain elementals in order to go through his journey. Perfectly okay, this one. Not one of the best Graft Gold games, but it's another decent one from a name that, in all honesty, is kind of tricky to go too far on with. Lastly here, a couple of intriguing ones from Beam Software. One is perhaps a bit familiar. Exploding Fist Plus, a sequel to the all-time classic Way of the Exploding Fist, and one that takes the game back to its roots somewhat. It's not a scrolling beat-em-up, it's back to fighting. The funny thing really, with that game, is that where Archer McLean's original International Karate clearly took some pretty hefty notes from the original Exploding Fist, Fist Plus returns the favour. You've got 3 combatants on screen duking it out, trying to earn as many knockdowns and points as possible in a short space of time. Plus there's a minigame. In this one you throw knives at ninjas, in a style that's quite similar to the bonus game in Shinobi. So yeah, in short, this game is a hell of a lot like IK+, but I suppose that Archer couldn't have had too many complaints about that. I guess you could call these games a bit of mutual appreciation. Sticking with a martial arts theme, we also have Samurai Warrior. This game's also known as Usagi Yojimbo in some quarters. Our hero happens to be a sword-wielding rabbit, taking on rivals in combat and doing the odd good deed along the way, giving food to peasants and so on, increasing his karma. It's a bit cheap and cheerful, and occasionally a trifle annoying, but not necessarily a terrible game. I mean, it's certainly better than International Ninja Rabbits by any stretch. Over the course of their fairly short history, Firebird certainly made quite a few deals. The one for Elite might be the most famous one, but the success of the game certainly buoyed them into making a lot of others, from exclusive publishing deals to outright acquisitions, and that's a big part of the reason why we need a whole bunch of videos to cover the companies associated with them. A bunch of these publishing deals centred around the most enigmatic of the labels. Rainbird would be the home of games developed by the likes of Magnetic Scrolls and Argonaut Software, and we'll certainly have more to say about the details of said deals and the games that were involved when we get to the stories of those companies. Similarly, Firebird would be the centre of an exclusive, multiple title deal with Odin Computer Graphics, a more arcade-centric company that had caused a great stir with titles like Nodes of Yesod and Robin of the Wood. Firebird would be more than happy to snap these guys up. A lot of these deals didn't necessarily go smoothly, but that's a subject for another video. One particular deal that ended up quite fractious was the one they struck with the aforementioned Graft Gold. This agreement angered Hewson, who'd previously published classic games of theirs like Uridium and Paradroid, and believed they had the rights to a game called Morpheus and Magnetron, the aforementioned sequel to Quasitron. Telecomsoft would trigger a legal battle over the issue that was ultimately settled out of court. The biggest deal by far, mind you, was the one that they did with Beyond Software. Again, we'll be talking more about this one when we actually get to Beyond itself, but this studio, originally formed by magazine publishers EMAP, were of course most famous for games by a certain Mike Singleton, particularly the immense Lords of Midnight from 1984, which is certainly the closest thing the Specky has to a defining and original RPG. Not long after Elite had bought Telecomsoft, a whole load of success and money, a deal was made to acquire Beyond in late 1985 for the then absolutely princely sum of £1 million. Yes, Beyond became the UK games industry equivalent of Trevor Francis. The Beyond deal was a big one indeed, including a fair bit of potential hit software that was now in the company's hands, even if some people at Telecomsoft wondered if they'd paid just a little bit too much to acquire them. Again, this is mostly a story for another day. What about some of the antics inside Telecomsoft and all of these various labels? The company certainly got through a bunch of figureheads in only a few years. After the tragic death of James Scola, Herbert Wright became the boss for a couple of years, before deciding that he wanted to make his way back to the world of journalism. His vacant slot as general manager was filled up by Paula Byrne. Byrne herself was originally brought in by Tony Rainbird to be the marketing manager for the label, and quickly became important to the company as a whole. As detailed on former Telecomsoft employee Richard Hewison's old Bird Sanctuary website, Paula Byrne was instrumental in moving Telecomsoft to offices on New Oxford Street in London in 1986, a space entirely of their own that positioned them further away from the British Telecom mothership. When Tony Rainbird decided that he wanted to go back to being an entrepreneur, Paula Byrne was promoted to the general manager of Rainbird, and from there took over the general manager position of Telecomsoft as a whole when Herbert Wright left, with Paul Hibbard stepping in at Rainbird. You see how all of these things do become a bit of a tangled web. It is worth noting that in becoming the boss of Telecomsoft in 1988, Paula Byrne would become one of the UK games industry's few prominent female leaders, alongside the likes of Anita Sinclair of Magnetic Scrolls and the Sales Curve's Jane Kavanagh, who had also previously been an executive in Telecomsoft. Another thing worth mentioning here, away from regular old games, is a little club that the company decided to set up in collaboration with a PR group by the name of Intermediates. The Silver Club was a quarterly newsletter filled with various bits of swag and also some pretty nice deals for its members. Being a member of the club would automatically get you 25% off of a Firebird Silver or Silverbird release, for example, and there would also be some quite good deals in the magazine as well. Different and certainly a lot more brighter than the company's other more industry-focused newsletter, Telecomsoft News, the Silver Club would prove to be popular indeed. In fact, it would be too popular. By the time it got to over 30,000 members, the cost of actually running the club and honouring all of these deals proved to be far greater than the revenue generated by membership fees, and it was quietly closed down. Still, it perhaps proved influential in another way. When Tony Rainbird left Telecomsoft, he jumped over to Intermediates and ultimately bought the company with the help of his silent partner, Anita Sinclair. Under his purview, Intermediates would set up Special Reserve, the huge mail-order operation that is undoubtedly familiar to literally anyone who picked up a British games magazine in the first half of the 1990s thanks to its plethora of adverts. In many ways, taking what had been done previously with the Silver Club to a whole other level. So, we're actually getting rather close to the end of the Telecomsoft company history. As has been said already, they didn't actually last all that long. But we still do have quite a few significant and at least interesting games that should be mentioned from the three labels, at least ones that weren't made by and aren't related to any of the companies we're going to be covering in later videos. There's certainly going to be a few names that you're familiar with in this roundup, that's for sure. How about Eyeball, for example? A few people know this one, and I'm sure it was responsible for a fair few broken joysticks back in the day. Perhaps broken computers even. The two eyeball games have you play as a ball, naturally. One of them is a top-down game where you have enemies coming at you in all directions but you can only fire vertically, and the second game is a side-scroller where you're forever bouncing around. The games are presented in a rather cool and kooky style, but holy hell, the difficulty is absolutely unforgiving. These must be two of the hardest micro games around, and on the whole the said difficulty is pretty unfair. Weirdly, they're quite similar in style of play to the two Cauldron games by Palace Software. Games that, amusingly enough, were also re-released by Telecomsoft on their budget label. Absolutely vicious games, this pair. What about Olli and Lissa? Another quite popular series of budget titles, the first two Olli and Lissa games came out through Telecomsoft, and they make for a not altogether too bad selection of arcade adventure type games. The first game, The Ghost of Shilmore Castle, is more on the arcade side. The ghost in question, Sir Humphrey, tells you an item that he wants, and you go and retrieve it, generally following a linear path. It plays out kind of like a single level that grows with every item, the next one adding on another screen. It's not bad. Most things about the presentation are lovely, although the music is a bit questionable, to say the least. But it does play quite well, offering that fairly typical micro-platformer challenge. The second Olli and Lissa game, Halloween, is more of the adventuring sort. The odd thing here is that you play as neither Olli nor Lissa, instead playing as their witchy friend Arabella, who's accidentally strewn 16 objects around the duo's castle and needs to retrieve them and put them back where they belong. It's okay. You fly around in this game, so there's no platforming, and it all comes down to your rather typical budgety sort of game. It's a tried and tested formula that kind of goes all the way back to Ultimate Saberwolf. As for the third game, Olli and Lissa 3, The Candlelight Adventure, is another adventure title, and you're back in control of Olli in search of the pieces of his car. On the whole, it's the best game of the trio. This came out in 1989, and I imagine it would have been released by Telecomsoft, but external shake-ups that we'll be covering soon got in the way. Eventually it came out through Codemasters, on their short-lived Cartoon Time label. Speaking of Codemasters, Telecomsoft did have a little go at releasing a couple of simulator games through Silverbird. And yeah, the results are questionable. You have the likes of Beach Buggy Simulator, which is basically a really cheap take on Moon Patrol that's not wholly terrible, but is seriously as budget gets. Turbo Boat Simulator is another one, and this one's kind of a mess. A boat combat game that's very poorly executed indeed, with controls that quite frankly boggle the mind. The most infamous of all of these games though is, of course, good old Ninja Scooter Simulator. Ah, the awesome name, and the truly awful box art. It's real classic budget shithousery, especially considering that you'd be rather hard pressed to find any ninjas in the actual game itself, and they're just here on the box to sell a few more units, a la BMX Ninja. The game itself is a pretty cheap clone of Namco's Metro Cross, and amusingly enough, it's probably the best of the trio. Not exactly good, but the game's actually a lot less offensive than the title and cover might suggest. Now, while we're on the subject of abject weirdness and budget as hell titles, what about Skateboard Joust? It's a take on Joust, only on a skateboard. The main difference here is that you have to do a jump when you hit enemies which might look familiar. They're certainly here to exterminate you, aren't they? Dialects aside, it's not a bad idea for a game, but the controls are completely balked to hell, and you just end up flying everywhere with damn near no control, and that lets the experience down somewhat. So that's pretty lousy. And you know what else is lousy? All of the bloody hero titles. This crap started with a miserable multi-event game called Ninja Master, one of the very worst games of its kind, quite frankly, and the rest of the entries in this series, Sports Hero, Oriental Hero, and GI Hero, well, they didn't get an awful lot better, and that's putting it very mildly indeed. It amounts to miserable versions of games that are of considerable more worth. This is kind of a problem with a lot of Telecomsoft's budget games. Whereas a studio like Codemasters wouldn't usually let the low price point drop their standards too much, these guys are perhaps a bit more willing to release any old crap, which perhaps isn't too surprising considering that they did publish Don't Buy Lists. That's not to say there aren't some other decent budget games. Something like International Speedway isn't too bad for what it is. Very cheap and cheerful to be sure, but it's an okay enough distraction for a couple of quid. Mission Genocide has a rocking title, but is also a perfectly decent if rather generic top-down shooter in the Exevius vein. It does have a somewhat okay line in terms of weird enemies, even if it's not quite on the Galaxy Birds level there. Fine enough for the price, I suppose. One of the absolute best is Mr. Wino, a lovely little gem of a platformer for $1.99, with smooth animation and controls and lots of kookiness as you help our hero get rat-assed enough to open up the doors and get to the exit of each level. I really like this one, and it doesn't seem to be a game that gets a whole lot of mentions. And hey, let's not forget that the absolute classic likes of Rebelstar and the rest of Julian Gollop's games were also in the budget range. Speaking of classics, there were also at least a whole load more older games that got a shiny re-release through Firebird. It was a good opportunity for people to see the likes of Invasion of the Body Snatchers, or Design Design's absolutely almighty and pioneering Darkstar from 1984. They did have a bit of an eye when it came to putting an old micro classic back into BAT. All being said, even if some of the lousier games in the budget range do stand out a bit, whether it's the hero titles or the dynamic duos or whatnot, there is still a fair bit of really good stuff to be found here too. What about the familiar old world of licensed games? Surely Telecomsoft had a bunch of stuff here. Actually, not really. There's only a couple of film licenses to speak of, and there's even only a couple of arcade ports. Of these, the most famous, or perhaps infamous one, is Star Trek The Rebel Universe, and we'll look at that one in detail when we cover Beyond Software, because there's an awful lot to be said about it. Of the arcade ports, I have mentioned the fantastic Graft Gold versions of Bubble Bobble and Flying Shark a couple of times. They're absolutely brilliant, really getting the feel of the originals and providing some of the best arcade action that you'll find on the micros. Outside of these two, Firebird also published a pretty good version of IREM's Mr. Heli, which was amongst their final crop of games, a fine take on the helicopter em-up that was handled by Probe Software. Lastly, and going outside the Atari 2600 range that Telecomsoft had released previously, they also released a version of Peter Pack-Rat, Atari's arcade game from 1985. It's kind of an odd one, seeing as this micro port of the game didn't actually come out until 1989 and was only released on the budget Silverbird label, but it's a very good version of the game from Software Creations. I actually quite like Peter Pack-Rat and think that the original game deserves a bit more love than it usually gets, so it's nice to see it get a perfectly decent treatment. As for licenses, well, if you put the Atari originating likes of Back to the Future and Superman to one side, we've got, Thunderbirds. One of the great British televisual feasts, and a game that is, infamously, completely baffling. You have to try and navigate both Thunderbird 1 and 2 through a huge ancient tomb in order to rescue a group of Egyptologists. You switch control between them with the fire button and can get some items at the start to help you on the way, but oh boy, the game is brutal and obtusely extreme, like patting your head and rubbing your tummy. I will say, however, that it's definitely ambitious and also quite different. I mean, it's a single player co-op game decades before you would see that more often. It's not a terrible game by any stretch, but it may well melt your brain. As far as the late 8-bit games from Firebird go, however, one of the most impressive of them all surely has to be Savage. It seems like the duo of David Perry and Nick Bruty always managed to stick their heads into a video somewhere, and here they are. Savage is a spiritual successor in style to Trantor the Last Stormtrooper, their previous hit game for US Gold, starting with the big sprite run and gun formula and adding on it further with other forms of gameplay and a hell of a lot more arcade action in this medieval axe 'em up. The amount of action here, especially on the Amstrad CPC and the ZX Spectrum, was considered an absolute revelation at the time. There are few games on the platform from this time that throw quite as much at you as this one does. Gameplay wise, it's okay I guess. The controls themselves can be a fair bit ropey, especially when our hero has to do any kind of jumping, but it's still rather entertaining and as a technical showcase, it's bloody staggering. This sort of game is exactly why Probe Software's Star Striker duo of Perry and Bruty became icons in the late 8-bit micro period. We have mainly been seeing a lot of 8-bit games in this video, those were the main platforms for most of Telecomsoft's existence, of course. But we do have some 16-bit games as well, a few of which are certainly not to be sniffed at. One of their bigger releases, and certainly one of their best remembered ones, is Virus, a game by the almighty David Braben. This game started out life as a launch title and tech showcase for the Acorn Archimedes in 1987, where it was called Zarch, and much like Elite, the game was then published by Telecomsoft on various other platforms, the ST and Amiga, PC-DOS, and even the ZX Spectrum. The Specky could handle the game in wireframe form, albeit a little slower. Now, much like Elite, this is another real game changer, a game that could happily carry a video entirely on its own. For many folks on the micros, from regular users to reviewers, this game was the first time they'd encountered a solid 3D title that moved so quickly in the home, and crucially, the game itself was really bloody good in the bargain. It's got sizable elements of Defender in that you have to tackle waves of enemies and destroy them quickly before the seeders can spread the titular virus over the entirety of the landscape, and I think one of the refreshing things about this game is that while you could see 3D being used for a more complex adventure or flying sim or something along those lines, here it's used for speedy arcade style play. Back in the early 90s, this game was something of a legend, even getting high up in lists of the best games on certain platforms. And even if its star might have faded a little bit over the years, this game was still quite the revelation when it arrived. Staying with David Braben, obviously there's the superb 16-bit versions of Elite. The Amiga one in particular by Mr. Micro is one of the best ways to play the classic. The wireframes are gone, nice solid colours take its place, there's a whole load of quality of life improvements and a pretty rendition of the Blue Danube. Plus, well, it's just Elite, isn't it? It's one of the best British games of them all for a good reason, and one of the happy things about Elite is that you'll quickly be able to see that almost regardless of which version of the game you play. Whether it's the BBC Micro original, this 16-bit Amiga one, the NES version by Imagineer, the standards just don't falter across the board. Also here, we have Elite Plus, the similarly updated DOS version of the game handled by Real Time and Chris Sawyer. And once again, yeah, all the things that make Elite both easy to pick up and addictive beyond reason are present and correct. This came well into the Microprose years, not released until 1991 and using Rainbird in some territories, is one of the very last games to come out under the label. Black Lamp is an original game by Software Creations that you can find on both the 8 and 16 bits, one that was primarily made for the Atari ST. As far as Software Creations goes, it's okay I suppose. I kind of have a soft spot for it because I played the Specky version a lot growing up, and it's still not too bad. A simple enough game where you have to travel around the world retrieving the 9 lamps, and the titular black one is guarded by a dragon. The graphics aren't too bad, although Tim Follin's music is perhaps not up to his usual standards. It's okay but not mind-blowing, and apparently this might have something to do with it having to be composed in all of a few hours. There's one fairly apparent thing that does hamstring the game. My god does our hero move slowly. I really wish that they'd upped the speed just a little bit and not given the character the sort of incremental movement controls you would find in some scrolling adventure like Tir Na Nog or whatever, as they don't really suit the game and having to actually take on enemies. Still, I don't mind the game, really. One of the last games released by Rainbird is also quite a memorable one for various reasons. Weird Dreams from 1989. The story of a regular guy who falls in love with a girl who just so happens to be possessed by a demon who's entered his subconscious, causing him to have these rather surreal and painful night terrors. You have to make your way through various strange scenes, trying not to die horribly along the way. Most of the story here is told in a novella that came with the game, written by Rupert Goodwins, and the game itself might also be familiar to watchers of the old ITV children's show Motormouth, where it featured as part of the show's phone-in quiz segments. There's a lot of good and bad here. The game certainly has an excellent way with visuals, and in creating these vignettes for poor old Steve to try and get past. However, playing it is really quite maddening. The controls are incredibly ropey, and the frustration level is high, with it being so easy to die the second you even slightly put a foot on. Honestly, it makes Another World look like a Barney the Dinosaur game in comparison when it comes to truly unforgiving difficulty. It's certainly a game that should be at least played once, just out of curiosity, but equally, it's never a game that I could recommend in the slightest. You might be a bit curious about the C64 version of the game though. It's a bit different in how it controls, and obviously the graphics have taken something of a hit, but it still looks pretty nice for the platform and, as an experience, it might be a bit easier to play than the 16-bit version. It's a bit of a shame that planned versions for the Amstrad CPC and ZX Spectrum never surfaced, as those would have been very intriguing indeed. Telecomsoft had certainly achieved a lot in the time they'd been around. Sure, the quality of their games perhaps wasn't quite as consistent as some of the other studios we've covered, but they'd put out a lot, and that list included some not insignificant classics. They were, by all accounts, a quite successful company indeed. In 1988, their total revenue amounted to £6 million. So it might have come as a bit of a surprise when, on February the 24th, 1989, an official announcement was made that British Telecom were looking to sell up, saying in a press release that entertainment software publishing is no longer consistent with the company's corporate goals as a world-class supplier of telecommunications and information products and services. It was certainly a surprising enough bit of news that it made the front pages of the industry papers, that's for sure. So, what happened? Why did BT make the move? There were a few reasons, it seemed, ones that were perhaps clearer to those on the inside of the company than they were to outsiders. Telecomsoft had actually grown to be pretty large, far larger perhaps than British Telecom themselves had ever envisioned they would grow, or perhaps had wanted them to grow. They'd grown to a point where they were kind of outsiders in the company. BT had no idea where to put them, and the Telecomsoft division basically operated entirely independently of BT as a whole, including their own separate officers. BT's management didn't exactly have a lot of influence over the nature of Telecomsoft's business. Speaking of officers, this was another little concern. According to Richard Hewison, the lease on the new Oxford Street building would be expiring in the summer of 1989, and BT appeared to be less and less likely to go through the process of renewing the lease for what was, by this point, essentially an independent company operating within their empire. For Paula Byrne and the rest of Telecomsoft's management team, the writing had been on the wall since August of 1988. That was when she had a rather frank meeting with BT's bosses about the company's lack of strategic fit, and she had been asked to find potential buyers for the company. Ideally, Byrne and the rest of the management would have liked to keep the whole company together as much as possible, and the best way to do that would have been to try and buy out Telecomsoft themselves, fully releasing it from BT's grasp. There was a lengthy period of negotiations to this effect, But ultimately the two sides were at loggerheads and no agreement could be made. Telecomsoft would be sold to another company. There were various potential suitors for Telecomsoft, although one has to admit that none of them look particularly good with the benefit of hindsight. Shocking almost no one, the Mirror Group were in there. And yes, that means Robert Maxwell and company, looking to add the name of Telecomsoft to the growing Mirrorsoft empire that was to be one of the biggest in Europe before, well, you know. Mediagenic, a company that already had dealings with Telecomsoft in the past, were also in there, presumably part of an expansion process that had already included the likes of Activision and Infocom, and would eventually result in crippling debt, buyout and closure a couple of years later. Japanese giants NEC were also rumoured to be showing interest. But ultimately, a clear leader emerged. Microprose, the big American company in pursuit of fortifying their British expansion, led the way almost from the get-go, and their purchase of Telecomsoft was ultimately confirmed in early May. No more cups of tea and foaming nut brown ale with Paula Byrne and company. Now it's gun-blazing yahoos and impromptu stunt flights with Wild Bill Steely. Despite the best efforts of Paula Byrne and the former Telecomsoft management, it became pretty clear that the studio was going to break up pretty quickly. Of the staff remaining at Telecomsoft who had been given an option to remain at the company under Microprose's purview, only a handful decided to take the opportunity, and ultimately the projects that Microprose had grabbed as part of the deal were more important in their eyes than the people. Of Telecomsoft's 3 main labels, Silverbird was the first to go. That happened almost immediately, seeing as Microprose had no experience and even less interest in publishing 8-bit budget software of that sort, and the Silverbird brand was sold to Western Supermare-based tape duplicators Tudor. Some games were moved away from labels like Firebird to be published under Microprose, as well as under their own newer sub-labels like Microstyle and Microplay. We've already mentioned Stunt Car Racer, but Core Design's soon-to-be big-hit platformer, Rick Dangerous, would also be switched from Firebird to Microstyle, as was Graft Gold Simulcra. A couple of games were gained by the Rainbird label, such as Maelstrom Games and Mike Singleton's rather popular strategy title, Midwinter. Something poetic there perhaps, considering Singleton's own history with Telecomsoft. Other games were nearly lost totally. Graft Gold's excellent Rainbow Islands conversions almost didn't come out, because in the time that it took to complete the sale of Telecomsoft, their contract with Taito had expired, and they had no right to actually publish said games anymore. Of course, Ocean Software quickly stepped in to sort that out. It became clear rather quickly that there wasn't exactly a whole lot of future in Firebird or Rainbird beyond completing the projects that were already in process, including some rather big affairs such as Starglider 2 and Carrier Command, games we'll be looking at when we cover Argonaut and Real-Time Games. Other standout titles include the exceptionally strange cinematic platformer Weird Dreams, along with a couple more arcade conversions kicking about such as Sega's Action Fighter and IREM's Mr. Heli. And after that, well, there wasn't too much. The Firebird label would be used one last time in 1990 for a Norse-themed action game named Fire and Brimstone. Rainbird's final releases were perhaps a bit more high profile. They included the excellent 16-bit update of the almighty original Elite, UMS 2, the sequel to the fairly popular Universal Military Simulator, and Flames of Freedom, Mike Singleton and Maelstrom Games' follow-up to Midwinter. But by 1991, Rainbird had also largely faded away. Microprose, faced with their own financial woes at the time due to a hideously unsuccessful arcade venture and general downturn in the success of their military vehicle simulation-based output, quietly discontinued the labels. They went into the scrap heap along with the rather short-lived Microstyle and Microplay. Now, even if Telecomsoft's ending was somewhat anonymous, the history of the company is certainly a vibrant one, going far beyond the success of big games like Elite. As mentioned in the beginning, a lot of very famous and very influential game makers and industry people moved through their ranks at one point or another, a highly significant list indeed. They certainly pushed hard and produced a lot of games. Even if they weren't always the best games, there's still a good portion of quality to be found here. Their story is, of course, a bit of a cautionary tale in some ways. It's the double-edged sword, perhaps, of being a company that exists within a huge conglomerate. It's somewhat perverse to think that, in the end, Telecomsoft were doomed by being too successful, with that success breeding independence and the company far surpassing the aims that BT had for them. But then, for a company like BT, one where a division's £6 million in revenue might not mean quite as much as it would to a regular software house, it eventually doesn't take much for people to decide that something like Telecomsoft didn't fit in with the general company aims, or the corporate goals, or whatever executive buzzwords you wish to employ. And of course, the history of Telecomsoft includes a whole load of other companies that got caught up in their wave, and without them, this story as a whole is still a little incomplete. And so, it's time to take a look at them, while we close the book on a company that, at least for a while, were able to pursue their own path in something a great deal bigger. Hopefully you've enjoyed this history, and until next time, bye for now. Thanks for watching another big old Kim Justice documentary. If you like it then, please do click like, it does help us out. If you're new around here, well, I've got a load of other documentaries like this, so you might want to click subscribe and have a look. Anyway, bye for now.